Have you ever wondered whether the person who raised you loved you more than the person who gave you life? Not because one failed you, but because both of them loved you so completely, in such different and painful ways, that neither one could ever tell you the whole truth. If you have ever felt a quiet uncertainty about who you really are, where you truly come from, or why certain things in your life have never quite added up, then this story was made for you. It is not a story about abandonment. It is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about the lengths a mother will go to protect the child she cannot keep, and the lengths a daughter will go to find the woman she never knew. By the end of this story, you will understand why a dying woman finally broke her silence after 37 years, and what that single, trembling confession set in motion for everyone left behind. Her name was Dorothy, and almost no one knew she existed, not in the way that matters, not the people in the small northern village where she was born, where the roads were unpaved and the winters were long, and the kind of hardship that shapes a person came early and stayed late. Not the family she left behind when she was barely a teenager, climbing onto a southbound train, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hunger so deep it had stopped feeling like hunger at all. Not the strangers she would meet in the years that followed, the city that would swallow her whole, the life she would try to build from whatever scraps she could gather with one hand. One hand, that is not a figure of speech. Dorothy had one arm. She lost the other one on a train platform when she was still a child, young enough that the memory of it would never fully form into a clear image, only a sensation, a sound, and then a silence that lasted the rest of her life. She had been selling drinks on the trains that ran through the countryside, the kind of work that children did when families had no other options, when the mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. If you did not work, you did not eat. She had finished her own route that day and gone back to help a friend finish theirs. She was crossing between cars. The platform connecting them shifted. Her foot slipped, and in the span of one heartbeat, everything changed. She was not yet 12 years old. The years after that do not come easily into language. There is a kind of suffering that does not announce itself with tears or drama. It settles instead into the bones, into the rhythm of daily life, into the particular way a person holds their body when they have learned that the world is not a safe place. Dorothy learned this early. She carried it quietly. She went back to work as soon as she could because there was no other choice, and she carried on the way that people in difficult circumstances always carry on. Not with grace or with acceptance, but with a dogged, exhausted determination that looks like strength from the outside and feels like nothing at all from the inside. She eventually made her way south. This was many years later, after the fighting had ended and the borders had reopened and people were beginning the long, uncertain process of rebuilding their lives in a country that had been torn apart and stitched back together in ways that did not always hold. The city in the south was loud and hot and full of people trying to forget things, and Dorothy found work there, the kind of work that asked no questions and offered no comfort, and she was grateful for it. She found a room. She found a routine. She found for a brief time something that felt almost like belonging. And then she found herself pregnant. She was not young anymore, not in the way she had been on that train platform. She was old enough to understand what the pregnancy meant, what it would cost, what it would require of her. She was alone in a city that was not her city, with one arm and no savings and a body that had already given more than it was meant to give. The man was not there, the circumstances were not good, and the family she had left behind in the north, the brothers and sisters and mother who had gone on without her, who had built their lives in that small village, and who still, she imagined, thought of her as the girl who had disappeared. None of them knew. She had not told them about the pregnancy. She had not told them about any of it. She gave birth in a hospital on a gray morning in the spring of 1990, a girl, small and perfect and completely unaware of the world she had arrived in. Dorothy held her for a few days. That is the part that is hardest to speak about. Those few days, the weight of a newborn in the curve of one arm, the smell of her, the sounds she made. Dorothy would carry the memory of those days inside her for the rest of her life. The way you carry something precious in a pocket you have forgotten about, discovering it again by accident at unexpected moments, in the middle of ordinary things, and feeling the loss of it all over again. She gave the baby girl to a couple from the north. She did not know their full names. She did not know their address. She knew only that they seemed kind, that they had come to the hospital for exactly this reason, that they wanted a child and could not have one of their own. She told herself this was the right thing. She told herself her daughter would have a life she could never provide. She told herself many things in the weeks and months and years that followed, and some of those things helped and some of them did not. She went back to work. She got sick. She went home to the village in the north, the one she had left so many years before, and her family welcomed her back without understanding how much she had changed or how much she was carrying. She lived among them quietly, declining in ways that were slow enough to be easy to overlook, and she did not speak about the baby girl, not once, not to her mother, not to her sisters, not to the brother who had always been the kind one, not to anyone. 37 years passed this way. They are not nothing, 37 years. They are a whole life. They are a generation. They are the distance between a small gray hospital in a southern city and a village in the north where a woman grew old carrying a secret that no one around her suspected, because she carried it so carefully, so completely, that it had become indistinguishable from the rest of her. It was just Dorothy, quiet Dorothy, the one with one arm, the one who had gone south and come back changed, the one who never married, the one who was always a little farther away than you expected, even when she was sitting right next to you. Her youngest sister was named Clara. Clara was the one who stayed. She was the one who was there when their mother got sick, the one who managed the household when their father died too young from a sudden illness that took everyone by surprise. Clara had raised the others, more or less, had cooked and cleaned and organized and worried, the way youngest sisters sometimes do when the family needs someone to hold it together. She was practical and warm and deeply loyal, and she loved Dorothy without reservation, the way you love someone whose suffering you have witnessed and cannot fix. Dorothy told Clara first. That is how it began. It was not a dramatic confession. It did not happen in a hospital room with tubes and monitors and the particular fluorescent brightness of medical equipment. It happened quietly, in the way that the most important things often happen, in a low voice on an ordinary afternoon when the light was coming through the window at an angle that made everything look softer than it was. Dorothy had been unwell for some time by then, the kind of unwell that everyone could see but no one wanted to name. She called Clara to sit with her, and she told her she had a daughter. She had given her away 37 years ago. She did not know her name. She did not know where she was. She only knew that she had been born in the spring, in a hospital in the south, and that she had been given to a couple from the north, and that she had thought about her every single day since then. Every single day, without exception. Clara did not speak for a long time after that. She sat with her sister in the quiet room and tried to absorb the weight of what she had just been told. 37 years. A whole person out there somewhere who did not know she existed. And Dorothy, sitting across from her with that particular stillness she had always had. The stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that they no longer remember what it felt like not to. After a while, Clara asked the only question that mattered. Do you want to find her? Dorothy looked at her for a long moment, and then she said yes. But she did not say it the way you say yes to something you hope for. She said it the way you say yes to something you have already given up on, something you are asking for anyway because you are running out of time, and you have decided that even a small chance is worth the risk of a broken heart. Clara took that yes, and she held it like a promise. Dorothy died before the search began. She died in the village, in the room where she had slept as a girl, surrounded by people who loved her and who now knew, at last, some of what she had been carrying. She was not old, she was not ready, but she was, perhaps, a little lighter than she had been before she told Clara the truth. And Clara, sitting beside her at the end, made her a promise she intended to keep. She would find the girl. She would tell her. She would make sure that somewhere in the world, Dorothy's daughter knew that she had been wanted, that she had been loved, that she had been thought of every single day. For 37 years, Clara did not know then how difficult it would be. She did not know that the couple who had taken the baby had no record, no name, no address, nothing but a city and a season and a hospital that no longer kept records from that far back. She did not know that the trail had gone cold decades ago, that finding a person under those circumstances was close to impossible, that she was essentially being asked to find a specific drop of water that had fallen into the ocean 37 years before and track it back to its source. She tried anyway. She asked everyone she could think of. She reached out through channels she barely understood, through community networks and online groups, and the particular informal web of connections that exists in communities where people are always looking for someone they have lost. She shared Dorothy's story, carefully with discretion. changing some details to protect the people involved. And she waited. Weeks passed, months passed. The village went through its seasons without her. Clara sat by her phone and waited. And then, one evening, a message arrived from someone who said her name was Laura. Laura had grown up in a small town not far from the northern city. She had been raised by a woman named Margaret, who was generous and hardworking and deeply kind, and a man who had died too early, leaving Margaret to raise 5 children alone. Laura had grown up knowing herself to be loved. She had grown up in a house full of noise and warmth and the particular intensity of a family that has been through hard things together. She had married young, had a child of her own, and built a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. But Margaret had told her something, not long before this moment, something that Laura had not expected. Something that had changed the way she understood her own story, her own beginning, her own place in the world. Margaret had raised Laura as her own from the first days of her life. And now, after 37 years, she had finally decided that Laura deserved to know the truth. Laura had been adopted, and the woman who had given birth to her, a woman with one arm who had traveled south looking for something she never found, had never stopped thinking about her. The message Laura sent to Clara was careful and tentative, the way messages are when the stakes are very high and the person sending them is terrified of being wrong. She listed the details, the year, the season, the hospital, the city. She had done her own research, pieced together what she could from the fragments her mother had given her, and every fragment matched. Clara read the message 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long moment the way Dorothy used to, and then she called her brother, and then she called everyone else. There would need to be a test. There would need to be certainty, because hope, in these situations, is both the most necessary thing and the most dangerous. It can carry you through impossible circumstances, and it can also destroy you if it turns out to be wrong. Clara understood this, so did Laura. They agreed without much discussion that they would do what needed to be done. They would take the test, they would wait for the results, and they would try, in the meantime, not to want it too much. But the night before the results were due, Laura sat in her kitchen after her daughter had gone to bed, and she looked at a photograph that someone in Clara's family had sent her. A photograph of 4 sisters, taken years ago, in a garden somewhere in the north, laughing at something that was happening just outside the frame. And something in her chest went very quiet and very certain. She did not sleep that night, and when her daughter woke up in the early morning and climbed into her lap and pointed at the photograph on the kitchen table, the little girl looked at it for a long time. Then she pointed at Clara's younger sister, the one who looked most like Laura, and said, with complete confidence, in the way that very young children sometimes say things that are more true than they know, "That is your mother." Laura did not correct her. She just held her daughter a little tighter and waited for the morning to come. But what the results would reveal, and what one small voice had already decided, was something that no one in that room was fully prepared for. The morning the results were due, Clara did not eat breakfast. She had been awake since before the light came. She had lain in the dark of her small bedroom in the village, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of old wood, the distant sound of birds beginning their first conversation of the day, the way the silence just before dawn has a different texture than any other silence, thicker and more deliberate, as if the world is holding its breath before it commits to another day. Clara had lived in this house her whole life. She knew every sound it made, but that morning everything felt unfamiliar, as if she were hearing it all for the first time. She thought about Dorothy. This was not unusual. She had thought about Dorothy every day since her sister died, in the quiet, automatic way that grief eventually becomes, not a sharp pain anymore, but a presence, a standing companion who walks beside you through ordinary things and reminds you, without speaking, of everything that is no longer there. But this morning the thinking was different. This morning Dorothy felt close in a way she had not felt in months. Clara lay still and let herself feel it. She did not try to explain it or analyze it. She just let her sister be near her for a few minutes, the way she had always been near, quiet, watchful, carrying something too heavy for one person and refusing to put it down. Then she got up, made a cup of tea she would not drink, and sat by the window to wait. The call was scheduled for late morning. Clara's brother Thomas was driving up from the city to be with her when it came. He was the oldest of the 5 siblings, a broad and careful man who did not often show emotion but who had been, since Dorothy's confession, visibly undone in the quiet way that reserved people become undone. not dramatically, but thoroughly, as if something structural had shifted inside him, and the outer walls had not yet caught up. He arrived at Clara's house just after 9, sat down at the kitchen table, and accepted the cup of tea she put in front of him without comment. They did not talk much. There was not much to say that had not already been said. They sat together in the comfortable silence of people who have known each other their whole lives and understand that sometimes company is enough. On the other side of the country, in a small apartment above a quiet street, Laura was doing something similar. She had sent her daughter to her neighbor's house for the morning. Not because the results would be difficult, or not only for that reason, but because she did not yet know what shape she would be in afterward, and she wanted to be able to fall apart privately if falling apart was what was required. She had cleaned the apartment, which was what she always did when she was nervous, moving through the rooms with a cloth and a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with actual dirt and everything to do with the need to be doing something with her hands. She had called her mother, Margaret, twice that morning, once just to hear her voice, and once because she had a question she had been turning over for weeks and could not seem to put down. The question was this: had Margaret always known that Laura would eventually look for her birth mother? Had she been afraid of it? Had she spent 37 years quietly dreading the day her daughter would discover the truth and need something that Margaret herself could not give? Margaret had paused for a long time before answering, long enough that Laura had wondered if she had said something wrong, something hurtful without meaning to. But then Margaret spoke, and what she said was not what Laura expected. She said, "I have been hoping for this day since you were small." Laura did not know what to do with that. She stood in her clean kitchen and held the phone and felt the words settle into her like something solid. "I have been hoping for this day since you were small," not dreading it, hoping for it, as if the truth had always been something Margaret wanted to give her, not something she was protecting herself from. She thought about Margaret then in a different way, not as the woman who had kept a secret, but as the woman who had carried one carefully for 37 years, waiting for the right moment to lay it down. She thought about what it must have cost her. She thought about all the times Margaret had looked at her and known something that Laura did not know about herself, and had chosen to say nothing because the moment was not right, because Laura was not ready, because the truth needed to be given with care or not at all. She thought, what kind of love does that require? And she was still thinking about it when the call came. The format was simple. A mediator named James had been coordinating the process. A calm and experienced man who had done this many times, and who understood that what he was holding in his hands was not a piece of paper but a whole family's history, compressed into a few lines of data that would either confirm everything or take it all away. He had Clara and Thomas on one line. He had Laura on another. He had the results in front of him, and he began by saying what he always said in these moments, that he wanted to take a moment before reading the results to acknowledge that whatever the outcome, the people on both ends of this call had shown a great deal of courage simply by being there. Neither Clara nor Laura was in the mood for acknowledgement just then, but they listened politely, because that is what you do. Then James said, "The samples have been analyzed by the scientific review panel. The results show that Clara's sister, the late Dorothy, shares maternal lineage with the sample provided by Laura." He said more than that. He explained the science, the certainty level, the technical language that translated into a simple and enormous fact. But Laura heard almost none of it. She heard the first part, shares maternal lineage, and then something in her body took over from her mind, the way it sometimes does in moments that are too large for ordinary cognition, and she was aware of herself crying without having decided to cry, aware of the sound coming out of her as something she did not recognize, a sound she had not known she was capable of making. On the other end, Clara said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, very softly, to no one in particular, and to Dorothy in particular, she found her way home. Thomas, who had not cried in any of the months since Dorothy died, put his face in his hands. The minutes that followed were the particular beautiful disorder of an ending that is also a beginning. James guided them through it with practiced gentleness, giving them time, letting the emotion move through before asking questions, making space for the kind of conversation that cannot be rushed or organized. Clara spoke to Laura for the first time with full certainty that they were family. Her voice was shaking but warm, the voice of someone trying to hold two enormous things at once, grief and joy so tangled together that she could not always tell which was which. She kept saying Laura's name, the way people say the names of people they love, not to address them but just to have the word in the air, to make it real by saying it out loud. Laura, for her part, was quieter than she expected to be. She had imagined this moment many times over the preceding weeks, had scripted speeches in her head, had thought of things she wanted to say, questions she wanted to ask. But now that the moment was here, all of it fell away and she was left with something much simpler, a feeling of enormous aching relief, as if something that had been held tight in her chest for as long as she could remember had finally, slowly, begun to release. She asked about Dorothy. She asked what she was like, and Clara, who had been dreading this question and longing for it in equal measure, found that when it came, she knew exactly what to say. She said, "She was quiet. She was strong in ways that most people could not see. She worked harder than anyone I have ever known, and she never once complained about it. She loved deeply and privately, the way some people do, without making a show of it. And she thought about you every day. I want you to know that. Whatever else you take from this, whatever questions you still have, whatever feelings come up that you do not know how to name, I want you to know that." She never stopped. Laura was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "Did she? Was she happy in the end? Was she at peace?" And Clara opened her mouth to say yes, because yes was the kind and gentle answer, the answer that would give Laura something to hold on to. But she paused, because Clara was, above all things, an honest person, and because Laura had waited 37 years for the truth and deserved something better than comfortable reassurance. She said, "I think she was lighter at the end. I think telling us, took something from her that had been very heavy for a very long time. I do not know if that is the same as peace, but she was not alone, and she knew we would look for you." There was silence on the line, the good kind, the kind that holds something rather than hiding it. Then Thomas, who had composed himself enough to speak, leaned toward the phone and said, "We have a lot of uncles and aunts who are waiting to hear your voice. The whole family has known for weeks and nobody has slept properly since." Laura laughed. It was a small laugh, still wet at the edges with the tears that had not finished yet, but it was real. And Clara heard in it, just faintly, just for a moment, something that sounded like Dorothy. The call ended with promises. Phone numbers were exchanged. Plans were begun. Laura said she would come north as soon as she could arrange it, that she wanted to see the village, the house, the room where Dorothy had grown up. She wanted to stand in the places her mother had stood. She wanted to put her hands on the same walls, look out the same windows, understand in a physical way the life that had produced the woman who had, for a few quiet days in a spring 37 years ago, held her close and called her her own. Clara said, "Come whenever you are ready. We are not going anywhere." After the call ended, Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a while. Thomas had stepped outside to call the extended family. She could hear his voice through the window, low and deliberate, the same careful cadence he used for all important things. The tea she had made hours ago was cold on the table. The birds outside had settled into their afternoon quiet. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning, and nothing was the same at all. She thought, "Dorothy, it worked. We found her." And then she thought about something Dorothy had said to her in those last quiet weeks, something Clara had not fully understood at the time. Dorothy had said, "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of disappearing. I am afraid that she will never know I existed." Clara had told her then that they would find her. She had not known in that moment whether she was telling the truth or just saying the thing her sister needed to hear. She had hoped it was the truth. She had worked, in the months since, to make it the truth. And now she sat in her kitchen with cold tea and the particular exhausted happiness of someone who has finished a very long task. And she understood that sometimes the things you say to comfort a dying person turn out to be true after all. Sometimes the promises you make at the end of a life turn into the shape of the life that comes after. She picked up her phone. She found Dorothy's name in her contacts. She had never deleted it, could not bring herself to delete it. She did not call, of course. She just held the phone and looked at the name for a moment. Then she put it down and went to call her daughter and began to think about what to cook for the dinner they would share when Laura finally came north. But 3 days before Laura was due to arrive, 3 days before the moment everyone had been waiting for, Margaret called. And what she said made Clara understand that the story was not finished yet, that there was one more thing Dorothy had carried that no one had known about. One more piece of the truth that had been waiting all this time to be told. Margaret called on a Tuesday evening, when the light outside was going gold and the village was settling into the particular quiet of early autumn, Clara answered on the second ring. She had spoken to Margaret several times since the DNA results came through. Careful, warm conversations between two women who had never met and yet were bound together by the same person, by the same 37 years, by the same small girl who had grown into a woman who now stood exactly between them. They had been polite with each other, respectful, feeling their way towards something that did not yet have a name. But Margaret's voice that Tuesday was different, quieter. The way voices get when something has been decided. She said, "There is something I need to tell you before Laura comes. Something I should have said sooner. Something that Dorothy deserved to know, and I did not have the chance to tell her." Clara sat down, Margaret explained slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who has rehearsed them many times and knows that no amount of rehearsal makes them easier to say. When she and her husband had gone to the hospital that spring, 37 years ago, the spring that kept returning to all of their conversations like a season that had never fully ended, they had not gone alone. They had brought with them a letter they had written for the birth mother, whoever she turned out to be, a letter that said, in plain and simple language, that they would love the child, that she would want for nothing, that they understood what was being asked of them, and they accepted it with their whole hearts, that if the day ever came when the child wanted to know where she came from, they would help her look. They had given that letter to a nurse to pass along. Margaret did not know if Dorothy had ever received it. She had never known. She had wondered about it for 37 years, had imagined Dorothy reading it or not reading it, had imagined it lost in some drawer or folder or gap between moments where important things sometimes fall. She had never been able to find out, and then Dorothy had died before Margaret knew to ask. Clara was very still. She said, "I will look." She did not know what she was promising. Dorothy's belongings had been sorted and stored in the months after her death, carefully, the way Clara did all things, in boxes that were labeled and stacked in the back room of the house. Clara had not been able to bring herself to go through them fully. She had gotten partway and then stopped, the way you stop at the edge of something you are not ready for, and she had closed the boxes and left them and told herself she would come back when she was ready. She went to the back room that night. She did not tell Thomas. She did not call anyone. She just went alone in the last of the evening light, and she opened the boxes one by one. There was the familiar Dorothy of it all, the practicality, the smallness of the accumulated objects, the way a whole life can fit into a few cardboard boxes and still feel larger than the room it occupies. Folded clothes, a few books, a small collection of objects whose significance only Dorothy would have understood, and at the bottom of the third box, inside a worn envelope that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft and the paper had taken on the texture of fabric, Clara found a letter. She did not open it that night. She sat with it in her hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing, a few grams at most, and also everything. She thought about Dorothy carrying this. She thought about all the times Dorothy had moved through the world with this in her possession, through the years in the city, through the long illness, through the quiet final weeks in this house. She thought about the particular courage of keeping something that must have been, every time she touched it, a source of both comfort and pain. She put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her pocket. She went to bed and did not sleep. The next morning she called Margaret and told her it had been found. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she asked, very quietly, whether Clara thought Laura should be the one to open it. And Clara said yes, without hesitation. Yes, Laura arrived on a Friday morning in the slow golden beginning of autumn, when the trees were just starting to think about changing, and the air had that particular quality of in-between. Not summer anymore, not yet fully fall, a season holding its breath between one thing and the next. Clara had been watching the road from the kitchen window for an hour before the car appeared. She was not what Clara had expected, and also exactly what she had expected. She was a grown woman in her late 30s with her mother's quietness, and something around the eyes that Clara recognized immediately, a depth of attention, a watchfulness, the look of someone who has always been paying careful notice to the world. She got out of the car slowly, the way people do when they are trying to make a moment last a little longer before it becomes real. She stood in the road and looked at the house, and then she looked at Clara. They stood there for a moment. There was no script for this, no ceremony. Just two women standing in the road in the autumn light, each of them carrying 37 years of a story that had finally arrived at its own ending. Clara crossed the road and held out her arms. Laura walked into them. They stood there for a while. Neither of them spoke. The birds were going about their ordinary business in the trees, and somewhere in the village a dog was barking at something. And the light was coming through at that angle that made everything look softer than it was. Clara could feel Laura shaking slightly, the way people shake when they have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and are finally carefully beginning to let it go. Then they went inside. Thomas was there, and two of the other sisters, and a cousin who had driven 3 hours because she could not stay away. There was food on the table, too much food. The way there is always too much food at moments like this, because cooking is how people say the things they cannot find words for. There was warmth and noise and the beautiful awkward confusion of people who are strangers to each other, and also somehow, in the most fundamental way, are not. Laura moved through it all with the same quiet attention she had shown at the door. She asked questions. She listened. She looked at photographs that were passed to her across the table, photographs of Dorothy at various ages, the rare ones, because Dorothy had always avoided cameras in the way that people who carry secrets sometimes do. Laura looked at each one for a long time. She did not say much, but Clara watched her face and understood that something was being absorbed, filed away, integrated, that Laura was doing the quiet internal work of making a new story out of the one she had always known, expanding it to include things that had previously been absent. After a while, when the food had been eaten and the conversation had found its natural slower rhythm, Clara put the envelope on the table. She did not explain it. She just placed it in front of Laura and let it be there. Laura looked at it. She looked at Clara. Clara nodded, just slightly, and Laura picked up the envelope and opened it with the careful hands of someone handling something that has already been important for longer than they have been alive. The letter inside was short. It was written in plain language, the language of ordinary people trying to say extraordinary things, a little formal, a little unpracticed, the way letters are when the person writing them is reaching for something beyond their usual vocabulary. Laura read it slowly, once, then again. Then she put it down on the table, very gently, face down. Clara did not ask what it said. She waited. After a moment, Laura said, "They promised her. They told her they would take care of me. They said they understood." She paused. She said, "My mother kept that promise for 37 years. She kept every part of it." No one at the table spoke. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, warm and unhurried, falling across the table and the cups and the faces of people who were still figuring out what they were to each other, and understanding, slowly, that they had time to figure it out. Laura picked up her phone. She called Margaret. It rang twice. When Margaret answered, Laura said, "I found the letter." The sound that came through the phone then was not quite weeping and not quite laughter. It was the sound that lives between those two things. The sound that has no precise name but that everyone recognizes immediately, because everyone has felt it at some point, in some moment when relief and love and loss arrive together, and the heart does not know which one to feel first. Laura said, "I am sitting in her kitchen, in Dorothy's kitchen. There are flowers on the table and Thomas made soup and everyone is being very kind to me." Margaret said something too soft to hear, and Laura said, I know, Mum, I know." She stayed in the village for 3 days. She slept in the room that had once been Dorothy's. She walked the same roads Dorothy had walked as a girl, before the train in the city, and the long, careful years of carrying. She sat with Clara in the evenings and asked questions and listened to the answers, and sometimes just sat quietly, not needing to say anything, which Clara recognized as a family trait. She went to the small churchyard on the second morning. She stood for a long time at Dorothy's grave. Clara waited at the gate and did not follow her in, because some moments need to be private. She could see Laura from where she stood, the shape of her in the autumn light, still and upright, looking down at the headstone with her hands at her sides. She did not see what Laura left there. Only later, when she walked over after Laura had come back through the gate, did she notice it. A small folded piece of paper, tucked into the flowers at the base of the stone. Clara did not read it. She did not need to. On the last morning, Laura sat with Clara's young niece, a round-faced girl of about 2.5, the one who had pointed at a photograph weeks earlier, and made her declaration with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned to doubt themselves. The little girl climbed into Laura's lap without asking permission, the way small children do, and looked up at her face with the frank and searching attention that small children have when they are deciding something important. Then she patted Laura's arm once, firmly, as if confirming a conclusion she had already reached. Laura looked across the room at Clara with something in her eyes that Clara did not have a word for. Clara smiled at her, and Laura smiled back. A real smile, the kind that starts somewhere deeper than the face and arrives there slowly, the kind you have not earned until you have been through something. Before she left, she stood in the doorway for a moment, the way she had stood in the road on the first day. She looked at the house one more time. At Clara, at the kitchen table visible through the window, at the ordinary and irreplaceable particular details of a life she had not known until now and would carry with her from this point forward. She said, "I am going to call you. Often," Clara said. "I am counting on it." The car disappeared around the bend in the road. Clara stood in the doorway for a while after it was gone. The autumn was fully here now. You could feel it in the air, a sharpening, a clarity, the sense of things becoming more precisely themselves before they change. She thought about Dorothy. She thought about Margaret. She thought about a letter that had traveled 37 years to arrive at the hands it was meant for. She thought about what it means to make a promise to someone you will never see again, and then to spend your whole life keeping it quietly without any certainty that it will ever be known. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the table in the spot where Laura had sat, as if some warmth might still be there, and found that it was. Somewhere that evening, in a small apartment above a quiet street, Laura put her daughter to bed and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. She looked at the worn envelope that she had brought home with her, sitting now on the table beside the photograph of Dorothy's sisters. The photograph her daughter had pointed at weeks ago. She looked at the two things side by side, the letter and the photograph, and she used there for a long time in the good quiet of a house where someone small is sleeping safely in the next room. She thought about calling her mother. She would later. She thought about Dorothy, and the train platform, and the spring of 1990, and the few days in the hospital that had become the 37 years that had become this. She thought about the little girl asleep in the next room, who would grow up knowing her whole story, who would never have to wonder. She reached out and touched the edge of the photograph gently, just the corner, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like a person with a missing piece. She felt, instead, like someone who has finally read to the end of a very long letter and found that it was addressed to her all along. Is there someone in your life who kept a quiet promise for you, year after year, without ever asking you to notice? And have you ever told them that you did?